This is Unit 1 for IT Security Policy, CT412. In this unit, I'm just going to introduce you to some of the concepts we're going to be discussing this semester. Just really a broad overview of everything that we're going to go over throughout the semester, and just give you kind of an overview of all these different concepts that we'll be discussing. So really, this is kind of a survey of the entire course, and of course, all these things that I talk about in this intro, we'll be diving into much more detail as we go through the semester. Before we start, we have to start talking about what exactly is information system security. At this point in your academic career, you probably can answer these questions, as to what information system security is. By the way, from here on out throughout the semester, I'll just shorthand this to ISS, so you'll see ISS as shorthand for information system security. So what exactly is it? It's the act of protecting information in the systems that store and process it. So basically, we're trying to secure everything that we use to store, process all of our data, all of our information in an organization. Obviously, security in the IT world is a little bit more abstract than in our physical world. It makes sense that a company would employ people and processes and procedures to protect their physical assets. For example, a store might have a loss prevention department, and that loss prevention department's job is to make sure that people don't walk out of the store with things that they sell to prevent that kind of loss. And it's obvious why people would do that, but in IT security, sometimes it's not so obvious to people that as to why we need to protect all this stuff and how to protect all this stuff. And IT security policy is going to help us define all that. So the protection is against risks that would lead to unauthorized access, unauthorized use, disclosure, disruption of business of the business itself, modification of data, so something that gets changed that shouldn't have been changed, destruction of data, something gets lost. So in most cases, when we talk about IT security, and I'm sure all of you have been exposed to this before, we always talk about the CIA Triad. So the CIA, you can sort of think of it as a big triangle, and each pillar of this triangle supports information security. So we have confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And these three things are important for IT security. A IT security professional's job can be seen as supporting all three of these. So confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Just to refresh your memory, so we have some information. So for confidentiality, the idea is that only the folks who are supposed to access data should be able to access that data, and or be able to change that data, or if somebody who should not have access tries to access that data, they're denied access to it. So for example, if we have an administrator who sets access to data, so we always start confidentiality. We have to start with this idea that somebody's responsible for assigning who can access the data from where and when and so forth and so on. So that person sort of assigns these controls. We'll talk more about controls later on, but that admin sets the controls. So we can have a data owner, which is someone who's allowed to both read and write that data. So in other words, they can make modifications. They can create the data, modify the data, read the data, obviously. So they have free reign over that data. And then you might also have a data user, which is somebody who should only be able to access that data. So for example, if this was an inventory system, our data owner might be somebody who can update the inventory, add additional inventory, things like that. But a data user is only allowed to look at the inventory to see, what inventory do we have. But they wouldn't be able to, say, change the description of something in inventory or change the SKU number or something like that. So they wouldn't be able to make those changes. Finally, in this example, we also might have a bad guy. So when the bad guy tries to access the information, hopefully our admin has properly set access, and they get denied access to changing that data. So this would be an example of confidentiality. For integrity, so let's take a look at how integrity might work. We've got a sender, somebody who's trying to send data, and the idea behind integrity is that the data, that you can trust the data that you have. So when you're looking at some data, there's no question that the data is as it's intended. So no one's modified it, nobody's adulterated that data or mangled it or whatnot. It is, and it's in the same format, in the same form as as when the person created that data. So here we have a sender, and that sender wants to get some data to a receiver. So pretty simple example. So the sender sends the data to somebody, and when they get the data, they hopefully can trust that that data is accurate and correct. But what if we insert a bad guy here in the middle? So here's my bad guy, and when my sender sends the data, the bad guy intercepts that data and then sends it to the receiver. The receiver may have no way to verify the data that they received. But hopefully with good security, with IT security, with these policies that we're going to talk about, hopefully we have a way for that user to realize that the data they received is incorrect, can't be trusted, and they throw away that data. We'll get into much more detail on some policies to help us achieve these goals, but just from a high level, this would be things like PKI, hashing algorithms, things like that. So finally, availability, which I don't have a slide for, but I'll go back real quick. So if we go back to our triad, we have availability, which is the concept that when somebody wants to access data, they are able to access that data. So availability is, somebody's trying to do a transaction, the system isn't down, they don't have to wait. So obviously availability is important, and the reason it's important in IT security is a lot of times all this security is about ensuring that availability. If somebody breaks into our network and takes out a couple servers, then we haven't achieved availability because our attacker was able to disable some of those services that we're trying to keep online for our users. So availability is important. In our textbook, they talk about 5 components of information assurance. So we already talked about the CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But in addition to that, our book also talks about authentication and non-repudiation. So authentication is identifying who someone is, so being able to identify who they are and what they're allowed to access. And non-repudiation is the idea that that you can always identify that no one can ever say, I didn't send that file. I guess is a simple way to explain it. And again, we'll get into more detail on some of this stuff and policies that might support these concepts. But non-repudiation is it's kind of complicated, but you're basically saying that that if you receive a file, you know who it came from, and the person that sent it can't deny that they sent that file. So you know exactly who sent it, and you know that they actually sent the file. You don't, somebody else didn't send it as if they were a different person. So you have some control there. Our book also talks about governance. The idea behind governance is that quite literally, governance is the act of governing. It's all of the processes and procedures to govern something. In IT security and in our textbook, in this context, when we talk about governance, it's how we create and enforce these IT security policies. So it's sort of the back-end minutia of how you create the policies and how you assess whether the policies are working. So it's it's sort of all that back-end management of information security. So in the context of IT security, the 4 things we talk about for governance is risk assessment, so assessing risk, the security policy framework, which is and we're going to talk about this. There's a whole chapter that covers security policy framework. This is how we we come up with a framework of how we develop these IT security policies, and then compliance, so how we enforce compliance with these policies, and then information assurance. So these are the which we just talked about, of course. So these are the 4 components of governance. So assessing risk, in other words, what are we at risk for? Then we develop a policy to mitigate those risks, and then we enforce compliance with those policies and hopefully obtain information assurance. So again, these are the 4 components of governance. So this is IS governance, or information security governance. So we're going to talk about the security policy framework in much more detail. There's a whole chapter where we cover IT security policy framework. But from a very high level, IT security policy framework is composed of 4 parts. We've got the policy itself, the standards, procedures, and guidelines. And I'll give you another slide here in a second that may clarify this a little bit. But basically, you have a policy that defines how an organization performs and conducts business functions and transactions with a desired outcome. So, in other words, a policy is here's why we're going to do something and how we're going to do something. the standards are a method to implement something. In other words, the standards are, again, they're a little bit higher level, but a standard gives you ways to go about achieving that policy goal. And we'll talk more about this relationship in just a minute, but procedures are exactly step by step how to carry out those policies, and the procedures can be established through standards and policy. So you might have a standard that says here's how we should do something. You might adopt that standard through a policy, and your procedures might reference that standard, or your procedures might help achieve that standard. And then you have guidelines, which is a parameter within which a policy, standard, procedure is suggested. So why are we doing this? What's the reasoning behind this policy? Different slide here that'll kind of put this in context for you. So here's our standard. So you have these standard frameworks for IT security, and we're going to talk more about these towards the end of this presentation. And then again, we discuss IT security policy frameworks in an entire chapter, but we generally start with a standard. So there's a standard out there that defines a IT security policy framework. That standard can be used to create our specific policies within our organization. So on the right side of that dotted line is something that resides outside our organization. Standards are industry-wide. So everyone, standards can apply to anybody in the industry. And there are specific standards for certain industries. We'll talk more about those later on. Some of the standards are derived from regulations. Some of the standards support the regulations. Some regulations say you have to abide by certain standards, or you have to use certain standards like NIST standards. We'll talk more about those. But then you can use those standards to implement your policies. So your policies can reference those standards. They can be loosely based on those standards. But generally, your policy sort of starts from that standard, which is nice because, a lot of times, think about writing, an essay for a class. Somebody tells you, write me an essay about elephants, and you're sitting there staring at a blank page, and you say, well, gee, where do I start? What do I say about elephants? It's a pretty broad subject. But if somebody tells you more specifically, here's an outline. This is what I want you to talk about with the elephants. I want you to start about what are the two different major types of elephants, then describe their habitats, and then who they're, what they eat and all that stuff. Now you've got some kind of framework, some kind of standard to work with a little bit. So security policy standards do the same thing for us. Again, you're an IT security person, and you're responsible for coming up with these policies, and you're staring at a blank page, and you say, well, where do I start? What do I do? If I ask most of you who are taking this class to go write me an IT security policy, and I just, say, go write whatever you want, without a standard to help drive how you're going to create those policies, you guys might not come up with the best, policy. But if you base it off of the standard, somebody's already gone and done the work and said, hey, here's what you should have in a policy. Here's how you should structure your policies. Here's the different parts of these policies. And that's a lot of what this class is. In this class, we're going to discuss a lot of that stuff, and we're going to talk about those standards. So the policies, again, can be derived from the standards, and then our policies themselves are supported by guidelines, which are basically, here, for our organization, here's why we're doing this. This is how it applies to our organization. And the procedures, which is exactly how to implement that policy or how to support that policy. So a procedure might tell users exactly what they're supposed to do. It could be step by step. It could be step one. You do this. Step two, you do that. And it may be even system administrators. So you might have policies. And we'll talk more about these policies and the domains that they apply to. But system administrators might use these procedures. So you might have a policy that says every computer has to have a certain antivirus, and it has to be patched. And you might have a procedure that tells a system administrator exactly how they should do that step by step. So it might even have specific things like you're going to install this specific antivirus, and you're going to go to this website to update the virus definitions, or you're going to use this server to update the virus definitions. So again, you might have some specific things in those procedures to support that policy. But the policy is going to be very broad and very general, and the procedures are very specific. They tell you exactly how to support that policy or how to implement that policy. An analog to those procedures that I was just talking about might be controls. So we'll talk more about specifically what controls are and what types of controls we have. But But more generically, you've got controls there on the bottom, and the controls are there to support the policy. So you might have automated controls, administrative controls. We'll talk more about what these are and how they work, but the control is there to support the policies. And why do we have policies? The policies are supporting some kind of business requirements. And we'll talk more about what those are and how we derive those policies. But those policies are there to support the business requirements. And then all the way in the top there, the business requirements are derived from regulatory requirements. So in many cases, we have regulatory requirements that say we have to do certain things, or if, for example, regulatory requirements might tell you that you have to protect patient data if you're a hospital, or customer information if you're a bank, or something along those lines. So just to see that relationship there, we start with with the regulatory requirements that helps us derive some kind of business requirements. Not always, though. Business requirements don't always have to be regulatory. They can be self-regulated, and sometimes we just do things because we want to protect ourselves. We want to protect ourselves from going down or losing business, or losing data or losing intellectual property. And those would feed into policies that support that business requirement. So a business requirement might be, we don't want to lose intellectual property. We need to protect intellectual property. We'll have policies that support that, and controls that enforce those policies, or help us enforce those policies, or prevent people from getting around those policies, or give us some kind of a procedure to enforce those policies. So continuing with these controls that I was talking about, there are three classifications of security controls. You have physical controls, administrative or procedural controls, and technical controls. So again, we've got our policy, and our policy is enforced through these controls. So a physical control would be some kind of physical device that prevents or deters access. Could be locks, cameras, guards, anything that's physical that prevents access to our assets. An administrative or procedural control is something that us humans have to do. So, for example, it might be a step-by-step instructions on how to carry out some procedure to harden the server, or to harden a workstation before it's deployed in the field. So those might be some administrators or procedural controls. The important thing is the human effort. A person has to do those. So those are procedures that we have to codify for humans to follow. And finally, we have technical procedures, which are typically automated controls. So things we put in place to support those policies. So, for example, we could put a firewall in, or we can put antivirus in, and that would be a technical control to enforce that policy. So, for example, a policy might say something like that users can't go to offensive websites for whatever reason. And a technical control could be put in place to prevent access to those websites, some kind of web filter or something along those lines. So that would be a technical control. And as IT people, I think most of us are most familiar with these technical controls. That's what we have the most control over. The administrative and procedural controls, we can write out and codify all these procedures that people should be following. But as we all know, not everybody follows those procedures. So in many cases, it's a combination of all these control classifications that help us enforce those policies that we painstakingly write, that we learn about in this class. There are three types of security controls, whether they're physical, procedural, or technical. All of them can fall into one of these three types. It could be a preventive control, a detective control, or a corrective control. So a preventive control is something that prevents something from happening. And you and I are probably most familiar with a firewall as being a preventive control. Or an antivirus is a preventive control. It prevents your computer from getting infiltrated by a virus. A firewall prevents people from breaking into your network. A preventive control could be a lock on a door. A physical preventive control is a lock. You put a lock on a door, they can't open the door to get in, just like a firewall. A detective control would alert the organization to a threat. So in a technical classification, it would be log review. So we can go through logs and we can detect that there was some kind of an intrusion. Or an IDS, an intrusion detection system, can tell us when there's an intrusion into our network. You can take a whole class on that. In the physical world, so a physical control that's detective might be Might be a camera. So if you put a camera in, or a guard dog that's barking, that alerts you that somebody has infiltrated the premise, or an alarm. Somebody opens the door, an alarm goes off, something along those lines. A corrective control is something that restores operations. So in the technical world, or a technical classification, that we back up and recovery would be a corrective action, or a corrective control. So we could have in our policies corrective controls that tell us what to do after somebody breaks into our network, after somebody steals our data, or something along those lines. So somebody might investigate how that happened. So they might do some detective work, looking in the logs. So there's a control that helps us establish how it happened, and then we could take corrective action to make sure it doesn't happen again and to restore those operations. So that's preventative, detective, and corrective. Give you kind of a real-world example of these. Here's my bad guy, and we're going to describe preventive, detective, and corrective controls. So my bad guy is going to launch a threat. With preventive controls, he launches the threat, or she launches the threat, and the incident is prevented. That's a preventative control. So that would be something like a firewall or a lock on the door. With a corrective, so after our threat is launched and something bad happens, a corrective control is going to restore operations and hopefully identify how it happened so we can prevent that. So hopefully corrective can help us add additional preventive controls to prevent that from happening again. So that would be a corrective control. And finally, with a detective control, our user tries to, or our user does break in. So we still need our corrective controls, but our detective controls hopefully can alert us that somebody broke in. So we still have to take corrective measures, but the detective tells us that it happened. And our detective controls also help us identify what has happened in the past. So in many cases, a detective control is telling us about something that already happened, and then we're taking our corrective, we're using our corrective controls to restore operations. Either way, the goal here is to try to get as much of these threats, move as many of these threats to a preventive control. And notice, with a preventive control, the incident's prevented, and we never have to go to the detective or corrective stages because it never makes it that far. So preventive control is, of course, the preferred, but and a detective and corrective controls can help us get there. So that's the relationship between preventative, detective, and corrective controls. And again, all three of these can be a physical, procedural, or a technical control. So again, a procedural control could be preventive. At a bank, for example, the teller is going to ask you for identification before they let you withdraw money. That's a preventive control to keep somebody from taking your money that isn't you. It's a very basic preventive control, but it's also very effective. People aren't going to try to go and withdraw money from a bank account that isn't theirs because they know that threat of somebody asking for identification is there. So you've already learned that we have policies and controls, and more generically, more broadly, a policy, as we've already learned, is what type of protections we need and why we need those protections. So why we're doing something and what type of protections we're going to apply. The controls is the minutia of how to do that. So the controls are how protections are implemented. The technical details or the procedural details. It doesn't always have to be technical. It can be procedural, or it can be it could lay out standards for how to do physical controls. But it's the minutia of how to actually enforce that policy, or how we're going to obtain the goal of that policy. So the policy is basically saying, here's what we want. We want users to not go to offensive websites. We want users to not be able to download viruses. We want to protect our customer data. We want to protect our intellectual property. Controls tell us how we're going to achieve that goal. So how we're actually going to implement that policy. And again, they could be technical, they could be physical, and procedural. And it's not enough to just create these policies and hope that they work. We want to make sure that we're monitoring those policies to make sure that they're achieving the goals that we had set out, and that we are achieving those goals. So we always want to try to improve policies. IT security policy isn't something we write this exhaustive policy, put it out in the wild, and hope for the best. They have to be constantly monitored, tracked. Technology changes over time. Human resources are constantly changing, so people are moving around. So we have to constantly, improve on these policies. So for improvement, if you look in our textbook, we can ask ourselves, is the policy achieving the desired results? So the question that we're always trying to answer is, we created this policy, are we achieving the results that we set out to achieve? And how do we do that? Well, we have to have some objective ways of identifying whether or not these policies are working. So our policy should have some kind of oversight requirement. So it should include some way to measure, some measurable way to see if we're actually achieving these goals. So we can monitor for things, we can review policies, we can track. For example, if we have a policy that says we want to block access to certain websites, we can do some sort of intelligent monitoring to say how often has somebody gone to those websites, or how often are IT people reporting that that they've noticed somebody going to a personal email account or something like that. And we can somehow track and monitor that, identify how well we're able to enforce that policy, or how well that policy is working, and then we can go back and revisit that and make changes and improvements over time. So like anything else in IT, it's a very iterative process. Like any, if you've taken any development classes, when you do software development, it's an iterative process, and that same iterative process is going to apply here, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So we can identify measurements in our policy, and we can have some kind of reporting requirements where infractions of our policy should be reported, or any noticeable encroachment on the network or something like that should be reported. We'll talk more about that stuff in much more detail when we talk about things like incident response team policies and things like that. So again, we'll talk about this stuff in more detail, but for right now, we're just kind of broadly covering all this stuff, and just from a broad perspective, we know that we need to have some policy oversight. So we have to have some way to objectively measure whether or not we're complying with these policies, or if the organization is complying with these policies, and how effective those policies are. If you recall, earlier slide, I showed you those 4 components of governance, and the governance being the minutia of actually implementing and creating all these policies. And one of the first things I talked about was risk. Why do we do all this IT security stuff? It all goes back to risk. So our purpose here is identifying risks and creating policies that help us mitigate those risks. But it all goes back to risk. That could be a regulatory risk, in that we don't want to get a fine from the government. It could be we don't want to risk doing something that's going to erode trust from our customers. We don't want to lose our property, like our intellectual property. So, all these IT security policies are really, the goal here is to try to mitigate risk. So to that end, for mitigating risk, we're promoting a risk-aware culture. So one thing that our book talks about is this idea that if you have IT security policies and you're constantly training and refreshing employees with these policies, and just having those policies there will help raise awareness, and having employees be aware of the risks and aware of the policies gives you a risk-aware culture where people are constantly thinking about, what's the risk of doing this? A great example again is the bank. That teller is going to ask for your ID because they don't want to risk giving your money to the wrong person, and they don't want to be responsible for that. So that's a very risk-aware industry. Those folks that work at the bank are very very aware of risk. The other part of this is policy compliance equates to acceptable level of risk. So a policy basically establishes, here's what we're going to do to mitigate that risk, and everyone who follows that policy has a reasonable expectation that they're doing everything they can to mitigate that risk for the business. We talk about regulation a little bit so far, but we haven't really dived into it too much. We're going to talk much more about regulation in a future lecture, but in one of the later units. But just again, from a very broad perspective, the government has all these regulations. Why do we have regulations? Well, regulations really start with laws, and laws establish these regulatory authorities that enforce those laws through regulations. What's the purpose for these regulations? It's really threefold. Our book talks about consumer protection. So some regulations protect consumers. So if you are and by the way, things like HIPAA, which protect patients, would fall into this category. It protects your personally identifiable data from being improperly used. It protects you from eating, bad meat. The FDA helps enforce those regulations that, we don't get poisoned by food. There's regulations that enforce, for example, the airlines have to comply with FAA regulations to keep us safe when we're flying in an airplane and things like that. So there's this sort of micro perspective of individual consumer protection. We all appreciate certain regulations because they help protect us from harm. But then overall, that aggregate protection of harm helps stabilize the economy. If we weren't all confident that when we get on an airplane that we're going to be safe on that airplane, then we would have a pretty unstable economy, because people would not want to get on an airplane and travel for business, and the airlines wouldn't be making a lot of money because they would, they wouldn't be getting a lot of business. So things like that can help us stabilize the economy. Although arguably, I would argue that sometimes self-regulation can work just as well. And we'll talk more about self-regulation later. But again, from a micro perspective, we're protecting the individual consumer. From a macro perspective, by protecting all these consumers in aggregate, we're protecting the economy as a whole. And then finally, there's tax revenue. So, a lot of regulations are there just to generate tax revenue. For example, the gas tax, generates tax revenue. Is there a greater public good? Of course there is. For collecting a gas tax, it helps us maintain our highways and our roads. And, the gas tax is a convenient way to do that because it taxes the people that use the roads the most. But these are the three sort of drivers for these government regulations that we have to worry about in IT. And I'm going to talk more about those regulations specifically, what regulations we might see in information technology. So some key concepts affecting policies: there's data privacy, full disclosure. In other words, when somebody collects your personal information, they have to disclose how they're going to use it. You have to be able to tell a company whether or not they're allowed to use that information, what they're allowed to do with that information. You should be able to opt out of them sharing that information with third parties. So there's rules and regulations that affect that. And of course, there's public interest, which I've talked about. So these are the sort of two categories of policies in relation to regulation. So there's consumer rights and privacy, and then just general public interest. So some policies and regulations are there just to protect the public, or in the public's interest. So for example, like I said, the gas tax, that's kind of in the public interest because it protects our roads and it helps us maintain our roads, at least in theory. So just a little bit about, why we have these regulations. For as far as IT security policies, we've talked about a couple things. We talked about risk. We talked about these different threats to our IT infrastructure, and we also talked about why we do that for protecting our the value of the business. But all of these are competing goals for security policies, or the competing goals within the organization. So an organization wants to reduce threats, so they want to reduce the likelihood that their data is going to get stolen, and we have to have some kind of policies to help us enforce that. We also want to protect consumers. Maybe we don't want to protect consumers all the time, but regulations certainly do that. So we've got regulatory pressures on our organization, and we've got these nefarious threats that's putting pressure on us. And then on top of all that, probably the biggest thing that pushes down on our on us is building value for the company. At the end of the day, if you work at a corporation, the most important thing is they have to be making money. If they're not making money, then the corporation's not going to exist for very long. So building value is certainly important. And all three of these kind of push and exert pressure on IT security, and our policies kind of have to work to kind of walk that line between these three major pressure points. And of course, if you're working in IT security, you'll feel the pressure from all three of these. You're constantly under threat from the from nefarious forces, such as hackers and attackers and all that stuff, and viruses and things like that. You're constantly trying to lock down against that. At the same time, you're also trying to protect your organization from the regulatory concerns, and at the same time, while juggling those two, you also have to make sure the company can conduct business in a way that helps them be profitable, which helps them build value. So these can kind of compete with one another. As far as regulations go, here's some examples of some U.S. regulations. There are a lot more, and if you look in your textbook, you'll see a bunch. I just picked a couple in here to show you. Really, there's two here. Sorry, the third one is duplicated, but you know, two of them that they talk about in our book is FISMA and HIPAA. So the Federal Information Security Management Act, that one is all about, it applies to the federal government or to any organization that processes government data. So if you're a government contractor, you might have to comply with the Federal Information Security Management Act. So if you're a company that does anything that's you know, a government contractor or works for a government contractor, or if you work for the government, then FISMA is going to be very important to you. Likewise, if you work in the healthcare industry, then HIPAA is going to be very important to you. So I work a lot in the healthcare industry, and we're constantly worrying about healthcare. So the Healthcare Insurance Portability and Accountability Act applies to healthcare providers. So these would be doctors, nurses, you know, anybody who provides healthcare. It can be lab companies that take lab work. It could be X-ray company, you know, radiology groups that do X-rays and things like that, surgical groups, anyone that provides care for patients. Health plans are the insurance companies, and clearinghouses are the people that collect the money and move the money around. But all of these people are constantly dealing with patients' personal identifiable information, so they have to protect that information, and that's you know, that's a regulatory you know, concern that they have to have. There are other laws out there. So your book mentions things like the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, the Children's Internet Protection Act. So, for example, you know, in my one life, I deal a lot in the healthcare world, so I have to worry about about HIPAA, and of course I teach, as I'm doing right now. You know, I work in education, so I also have to worry about the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which has all kinds of regulations that define, you know, how I have to protect your information as a student. So if somebody were to email me and say, hey, can you tell me how John is doing in your class? I can't tell them what your grade is. I can't tell them what your attendance records are. If the parent of one of my students in a college class comes to me and says, can you tell me, you know, has Johnny been going to class lately? I can't tell them that. I can't disclose that information because there's regulations that tell me that I'm not allowed to do that. So it's important for me to be aware of those regulations. And likewise, for all of you that work in the industry or are going to work in the industry, you're going to want to get to know which of these regulations apply to your industry or to your company. It's important to know that, and that helps you sort of frame these IT security policies. And one thing I like to kind of do too, and I'll talk more about this when we talk more about these regulations, is it also kind of gives you an excuse, right? So, you know, I work in healthcare, and you know, we might tell doctors that you can't email a patient's record from point A to point B. They'll say, well, gee, it would be so much more convenient if I did that. And we say, you know, we know that from a security perspective, it's not a good idea because you're transmitting data in you know, plain text. But the doctors don't really understand that. They say, well, what do I care? You know, I just want to get these records to another doctor, to a patient. But we can say, well, don't blame me. It's HIPAA. You know, there's the risk is if we get caught doing that, if somebody finds out we did that, if the patient knows we did that, we're in violation of HIPAA, and we can face fines and things like that. So, so a lot of times I don't like to take an adversarial approach to these regulations, but rather say the regulations are helping me enforce these IT security policies. You know, a lot of times we know that it's a good idea to have these policies, and the regulations help us enforce those even within our own organization. So like everything else in IT, we have some kind of life cycle of how we develop these policies. So there's a very basic life cycle approach that our book talks about, where we talk about doing planning. So we start with planning. In other words, you know, at the planning phase, what do we want to do? How do we want to get there? You know, what are our goals? So that's the planning phase. So we're trying to define what all of our risks are for IT security policy. And then we move to the implementation stage, where we take all these risks and we actually write the policy. So in implementation, we're writing these policies, we're building the policies, and then we're going to support those policies. So once the policies are done, they're out there. You know, hopefully it's going to minimize threats. We're going to analyze data over time, make sure our policies are working. provide operational and management support. So, answer users' questions on how to comply with a policy, things like that. Make sure we've got technical controls in place. Make sure, all of our controls are in place and complying with the policy. And then periodically, we have to evaluate. So we're going to evaluate if these policies are working. And finally, once we do the evaluation, a lot of times we say, okay, there's some shortcomings here or there. We go back into the planning stage and we just keep circling around and around. So, this life cycle never ends. And it's like any other development project in IT. You're never really finished with anything in IT. At least it always feels that way. It always feels like we're in this iterative process where we're just constantly improving, which is probably a good thing. And our IT security policies are no different, where it's an iterative process. We're constantly trying to improve these policies. And as you know, technology is always improving. Technology is always changing. We have to constantly keep up. So this process is going to go around and around. So this is a very generic life cycle for IT security policies. So as far as creating a IT security policy framework, there's a couple steps that we go through to create the frameworks. First, the business recognizes the need for a new policy to be developed. So we recognize we have some new risk, or that we have risk, and we need to develop a policy. So we start collecting documents relating to the new policy. We're going to analyze existing policies for overlap and coverage. So do we already have policies in place that will help us achieve this goal? Might develop a case study related to the new policy. Examine existing frameworks for policies that can be used, and then finally implement the new policy and add to the policy change control board process. So in our textbook, they talk about all these documents, and we're going to talk in much more detail about all these documents in the next lecture. But we have a purpose and a mission for the policy. So we start with our purpose and mission, our responsibilities for enforcing the policy, compliance issues that are covered by the new policy. So what regulations does it reference? And the scope of policy coverage. And again, this is the framework for our IT security policy, and we're going to talk more about IT security policy frameworks later on. So as far as policy implementation goes, again, it's an iterative process like everything else I talked about. So we to implement our policies, we create or update the policy, then we enforce the policy, we respond to any incidents as we enforce those policies. We analyze those incidents, so that would be sort of the detective controls I talked about. We might educate employees or make changes, and then we go back and we update our policy. So again, it's an iterative. So after we implement a policy, we're going through this iterative process. Again, I'm going to talk in much more detail about this in a lecture later on, but just again from a very broad perspective, this might be a policy implementation life cycle. Now that we know a little bit about policies, we'll start to talk about why we have policies, and of course one of the major reasons is to minimize our liability. So without security policies, it's very difficult to control those liabilities. So liability arises when the organization fails to meet its obligations. So that could be our regulatory obligations, it could be our business obligations. We fail to sell enough goods, we lose our intellectual property, something along those lines. So example, legal or contractual requirements might be a failure to meet obligations. If we fail to meet those obligations, some of the impacts are fines, restriction of business, lost business through loss of customer trust. So if or lawsuits, we can open ourselves up to lawsuits. So for example, I work a lot with HIPAA. If we don't follow those HIPAA regulations and don't have policies in place to enforce those regulations, it opens us up to possible fines from the federal government. We can lose business. Medicare or Medicaid might, say, hey, we're not going to allow patients to go to your practice anymore, something like that. Customers might say, hey, don't go to Dr. Jones because, they just had a major data breach and all your records might get stolen. A great example of that is the VA. It seems like every other week the VA is losing patient records. So I think a lot of people just kind of make the assumption that if you go to the VA that, there's a good chance your records are going to get stolen from somebody's car or something. Which could certainly affect their, the trust of their customers. You can open yourself up to lawsuits. So good security policies are going to reduce all these liabilities. So some tools to reduce business liability: acceptable use policies, which we're going to talk in much more detail about later on. But that basically establishes with employees what their responsibilities are, and it helps us establish the separation of employee versus company. So it kind of helps, and that helps us. We'll talk much more detail about that from a legal perspective, though. That helps us establish that an employee's actions are not necessarily the actions of the company. So I might do something that the company doesn't approve of, but we can establish some legal separation between myself and the company, so that the company can say, well, we have a policy that says you're not supposed to do that. He did it anyway. So, those were his actions. That was not something that was supported or endorsed by the company itself. And again, we'll talk more about that stuff later on. So guidelines for employee behavior. Confidentiality agreements, which basically define what we're allowed to share outside the company. Again, that's going to help us protect intellectual property, which is, of course, a liability. Insurance policies allow us to transfer the risk to someone else. So we can say, you know what, we have this risk, but instead of mitigating that risk with policy, or in addition to mitigating that risk with policy, we're going to augment that mitigating that risk by getting insurance. So for example, we all know that a fire is a good possibility in our data centers. Most of us are going to put some kind of fire suppression system in, but at the same time, we have fire insurance to hedge our bets. We know that eventually a fire could happen, so I have fire insurance. I think all of us have auto insurance. None of us wants to be in a car accident. None of us really expects to be in a car accident, but there's always a good chance, especially if you live in New Jersey where I live, that something's going to happen. Somebody's going to hit your car, so you always want to be prepared for that. So, of course, having insurance is a good thing. We'll talk more about that in detail when we talk about risk policies. So we're going to talk about risk management policies and how to objectively identify what your risks are and and how your policy should mitigate those risks and things like that. But just from a high level, know that we can transfer risk or we can mitigate risk with some other things, all with our IT security policies. This is always one of the harder concepts, I think, for a lot of IT security people to accept, but it's a reality of life that in a lot of cases we go through all this work to create these hardened policies that we know if everybody follows these policies that we're not going to have data get lost, we're not going to get stuff broken into, and so forth and so on. So we try to make these really great policies, but sometimes we have to have a way for people to deviate from those policies. Great example is Windows XP. As I'm recording this right now, Microsoft is getting ready to cut off all support for Windows XP. No more updates, nothing, no more support, none of that stuff. So from an operational standpoint, it would probably be good policy to not allow Windows XP on your network, right? You're going to say, okay, Microsoft no longer supports Windows XP. They clearly no longer support Windows 2000 or, Windows Millennium or 3.1 or whatever it is. So you're not going to allow those operating systems on your network, and that's just good policy. However, there may be times people need to use that software or that operating system. So you have to have some method of allowing people to deviate from that policy in a structured way. So I'll give you a great example. I work again in healthcare and in the radiology space. And in radiology, we're very heavily regulated, and there are many of us that still use Windows XP in embedded systems, like on X-ray machines and things like that. And it's very difficult to change that. If you have an old X-ray machine that's running Windows XP, you can't just upgrade it to Windows 7. There's no upgrade path. It's embedded. You don't really have access to do that. And by doing so, you're making some pretty big changes to that software. And based on the class medical device, that's always, not always a good idea. So your only other option is to remove that entire medical device. If you paid, $300,000 for an X-ray machine, it's not always economical to just throw it away. So if the IT department, your IT security people come in and say, oh, you can't use that Windows XP system because it violates our policy, and they say your only option is to take it off the network, you're really not supporting the mission of the organization. The organization might not be able to absorb the cost of a new X-ray machine that's $300,000, and thus won't be able to take care of patients as effectively. So as IT security people, we have to deal with that. We have to have some escape plan for how to deal with those issues. So it's important in IT security to support those concerns. So some deviation is inevitable and may even be acceptable, and we should have some kind of an exception or waiver process. We should codify this process to say, you know what, if you want to do something that violates a policy, here is a path to do that, because you know that if you don't do this, people in the business are going to know that they have to deviate from policy, and instead of making it official and having some official path, instead they're just going to do it, or they're going to hide it from you. And sometimes it's better to know than to not know. I'd rather know that there is this threat of, we know we've got this one rogue Windows XP system, but there's a reason we have it. We justified the reason for having it, and now we kind of know what we're dealing with. We know that that's something that we have to protect, and maybe there's some other controls that we can put in place to help protect that, so we can try to mitigate that residual risk from that exception. And it provides us a formal approval process to say, here's a process that you can follow to deviate from the policy. And again, and sometimes maybe we won't allow people to deviate from that process, but at least if it's all codified in policy, people feel like there's a way that they can, get around those policies. And sometimes it can be something as simple as, we have a policy that says we can't receive links in an email, but maybe there are certain email addresses that we do want to get links from. So, there could be some waiver form to say, hey, for this email address, we don't want to block, links in the emails. We don't want to remove those for whatever reason. So it's good to have that stuff. And of course, we can document those approved deviations, so we know, okay, here's all the times that it's okay for someone to deviate from policy, because we've already approved those deviations. So some roles and responsibilities. We're going to talk about, who are all these people that are involved in this, in these policy, in creating these policies. We have government agencies, which are creating regulations for federal and state and local and all that stuff. We've got privacy and compliance officers within our own organization that help us identify that we're complying with those regulations. We have auditors that, again, can help us make sure we're complying, and regulators that will enforce regulations. So where I work, about every year, the FDA comes in and they do a big audit, and anything that we're doing wrong, they either they give us a fine for it, or they write us up some kind of a violation, and it goes on the internet where all of our customers can see it. Again, these are some basic roles and responsibilities outside our organization. So again, these are all people outside our organization that have some role to play in our IT security policy. Within our organization, we've got these types of folks. We've got our chief privacy officer, executive and senior management, of course, are going to be heavily involved in IT security policy. Human resources is usually responsible for, in some respects, enforcing, but also, enforcing policy, but also, making sure that the people who have violated the policy are punished for doing so. So again, that all helps with the enforcement. The IT staff is going to make sure. So the IT staff, of course, are a very important part. They're the ones that are going to be maintaining a lot of these technical controls, coming up with a lot of these security policies, and of course the legal department to make sure that you're complying with those regulations and the laws, and how to deal with after something happens, after you've got a bunch of data that was stolen, what are the steps that we have to take. So again, these are roles and responsibilities. We're going to talk much more detail about all these different people and how they affect IT security policy later on in the course. Acceptance and enforcement challenges. So as far as acceptance goes, some challenges: lack of organizational support, lack of employee motivation, limited awareness and understanding. So when we create all these IT security policies, if we do it in a vacuum, it's going to be difficult to get acceptance from employees. And sometimes acceptance is as easy as telling people, here's why we have these policies. We're implementing these policies, and here's some reasons for us doing this. So that a lot of times that can help with acceptance. We're going to talk in much more detail about acceptance, of course, later on. But these are just some basic concepts here, and some challenges in getting acceptance on IT security policies. And I'm sure all of you can relate to that. If anyone's had a job where there's any kind of controls in place, controls sometimes can make it difficult to do your job, or you want to check your personal email, but they won't let you do that, or you want to listen to internet radio, and there's some policy in place to prevent you from doing that, and you think, well, this is very inconvenient for me. But hopefully through employee awareness and education and things like that, we can help people understand why we're doing that, and maybe that helps us gain some acceptance of those policies. Again, also enforcement. So policies that are poorly written will be difficult to enforce. Non-compliance is not reported. So, for example, I just mentioned internet radio. Most managers have bigger fish to fry than to report to IT that 2 of their employees are listening to Google Music or something all day long. And in many cases, people want to listen to their music because it helps them do their job. I listen to music while I'm working a lot of times while I'm writing code and things like that. It certainly helps me. So that could be a challenge to enforcement. Again, we're going to talk more about these enforcement challenges and how we can mitigate those challenges later on in the semester. Protecting intellectual property is, of course, a major goal of our IT security policy, and in many cases, that's one of the most important things that we own as a business. So, what exactly is intellectual property? It's information that's owned that provides some kind of business advantage. So, some examples are ideas, products, inventions, business processes, business models. So, anything that's proprietary to your corporation, your company, your organization is going to be intellectual property. And that's something that certainly, most companies want to protect. How do we protect that? So by classifying and labeling data, that helps us, know what to protect. So for example, you might have sensitive, confidential, or public data. We'll learn a lot more about classification, I think in maybe chapter 10. So in a lecture later on in the course, we talk about different ways to do classification, why we do classification. But this is another way to protect intellectual property. You don't really know what to protect unless you know what it is. If somebody's walking around with a highly sensitive document, if you don't know that, you don't know to say, hey, maybe you should protect that document. So likewise, it helps to label those. So when possible, we want to mark those files with their classification. And again, we'll talk more about methods to do that and policies that can enforce that, and how we can put that into place. So again, we're going to protect digital assets, files, graphics, audio, video. These all could contain intellectual property. And like I said, we don't really know what we don't know. So inventorying all of our intellectual property is usually a good idea. Just make sure we know what we have and where it's located. Personally identifiable information is important in this course. A lot of our regulations deal with personally identifiable information. So this category of data may need special treatment due to, and here's some bullet points for you, customer expectations of privacy. I think we all have some expectation of privacy. Legal requirements. Laws may vary by state and industry, so different areas of the country might have different laws on how we have to protect customer information. Different industries have different laws. So for example, I talked about HIPAA, and there's also banking and Sarbanes-Oxley and things like that. They all deal with personally identifiable information in different ways. So a security policy should address this with disclosure to individuals. So we tell people what's being stored and how we're using it. We should encrypt our personally identifiable information. So while it's at rest or while it's in transmission, we should have some level of encryption, and that again would all be codified in our security policy. So our security policies would define, from a policy level, it would tell us that all data should be, this type of data should be encrypted, and from a procedural level, it might tell us exactly how we're going to accomplish that. There could be some human controls, there could be some technical controls. Again, we'll talk about this stuff in much more detail later on. I touched on industry self-regulation a little bit earlier. I keep talking about these regulations, the government telling us what we can and can't do. And of course the libertarian in me doesn't always like that idea that, the government, creates all these crazy regulations. I can start to sound like John Stossel here if I keep going, but in addition to, we have these government regulations, but there's also industry self-regulation where industries regulate themselves. A great, kind of the classic example of this self versus government regulation would be, I'll give you an example of 2 industries. One is is food processing. So back in the old days, there was no regulation on food processing, and somebody wrote a book can't remember his name, but somebody wrote a book and that kind of described all the bad stuff about food processing and how dangerous it was and how horrible our food was. And that created an outcry and created what's, today is the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which now enforces all of these food processing regulations to make sure we don't get sick when we eat meat or, processed foods. On the flip side, we have, payment processing clearinghouses that process our credit cards like MasterCard and Visa and American Express and things like that. And, those companies don't want to lose, they don't want to lose money. So they've sort of created their own regulations outside the government. They say, you know what, we need to protect our assets and protect our money. So if somebody wants to take one of our credit cards, they have to abide by these regulations that we create. And the consequence of not following the regulations from those payment processing companies is you're not allowed to take their credit card. So if I want to accept Visa at my business, if I'm not protecting my customers' payment card information, if I'm not protecting their card number and the CCV number and all that stuff, if I'm not protecting that data and encrypting that data, and the payment companies find out about it, they won't allow me to take those cards. I have one less way for customers to pay me, and nobody wants that. So that's an example of self-regulation. So industries can self-regulate to avoid government regulation, and payment card has been very good at that. They have very powerful regulations and very powerful standards that help define, and help codify ways that we can protect patient information and their payment card information. At the same time, we've got the FDA, which helps us protect our food, and that's the government enforcing those regulations. So kind of two extremes in that case. And one misconception is that businesses that process foods didn't want the FDA. But I think most historians would tell you that that those companies really kind of actually lobbied for the FDA because a lot of them knew that if their customers didn't have confidence in their products, that they would lose business. People would start to find other ways to get food than buying it at the grocery store. So to protect their industry, they basically got the government to enforce regulations, and that also prevents their competitors from cutting corners and hurting their business. So lots of reasons. So it can kind of go both ways. But again, self-regulation is where the industry finds ways to regulate itself. It's obviously less costly and more flexible because, private industry seems to do things a little bit more in a more agile way than government can possibly do it. And industry standards can turn into best practices and leading practices, which we'll talk about later on. So industry, some examples of industry self-regulation. I already talked about PCI DSS, which is the payment card industry data security standards. Again, this is not government regulation. It's enforced by the payment card processors. So it's not something that you have to comply with legally, but if you want to take credit cards, you have to comply with that, or at least prove that you comply. SAS 70, which is Statement on Auditing Standard. So many industries require SAS 70, ITIL, which is Information Technology Infrastructure Library, and so forth and so on. So there's lots of these different self-regulation examples. And again, we'll talk about this in much more detail later on. Again, going back to why are these security policies important? Why do we worry about security policies? I think it's pretty obvious at this point. But with information security policies, we have better data protection, we've got change control, risk management, we protect from insider threats, we increase our availability. So all that CIA stuff that I talked about, we have more of protection for that stuff. So we achieve those goals much more efficiently with IT security policies. Without IT security policies, we have higher cost. We may not comply with regulatory compliance. We may have vulnerability from mishandling data. We're vulnerable to attack. It's kind of the Wild West without these security policies. So it's definitely a good idea to have security policies. And if you had to justify this to management, I think it's a pretty easy sell to justify to management why we should have IT security policies. So reducing risk through operational consistency. Business processes should be repeatable and sustainable to support better risk detection and removal, operational efficiency. So through IT security policies, our organizations can enforce the business process and reduce operational deviation. So basically, IT security policies give us structure. They give us a way to enforce some kind of structure around these transactions and around these processes. Without an IT security policy, it's difficult to have that kind of structure. And again, with that structure, when we have repeatable, and supportable processes, we have better risk detection and removal, et cetera, et cetera. So we know why having these repeatable and procedural processes is important. And through policies, we can enforce those processes and reduce deviation from those processes. So again, it all goes back to the bottom line. So obviously IT security policies can help us with that stuff. The regulations protect individuals from privacy and consumer rights. They protect shareholders, which promotes trust in a healthy economy. Public interest, obligations beyond self-interest. So the public welfare as opposed to that macro view of interest. So again, this is all reasons that so I just talked about reasons we have policies. Here's reasons that we have regulations. And we already talked about this stuff a lot. And again, we're going to get into much more detail on all this stuff. And finally, this is our last slide. Almost done here. I know it's been over an hour, so thanks for hanging in there. So benefits of using established security frameworks. We're going to talk about some of these established security frameworks later on, in a different lecture. But these are proven standards based on years of experience across multiple industries. It's a high quality end product. We know it works. Evidence of proper risk management, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to talk in much more detail about these established security frameworks. We're going to talk about some of these different methodologies that are already out there and some of these techniques for developing IT security policies and these frameworks that already exist that we basically use in this course. We're going to use two, and I'll talk more about them in another lecture, but we basically use these IT security policy frameworks to sort of practice developing our own IT security policies throughout this course. So again, I'll talk more about that in another lecture, but hopefully this is enough to kind of give you a nice, a good start on what IT security policy is all about and basically the direction that we're going to be going throughout the semester. And just from a high level, for the first half of the semester, we're really talking more about the minutia of how we develop these policies, what the parts of these policies are, the regulatory things we have to worry about with these policies, and how all that stuff ties together. And then in the second part of the course, so after the midterm, we talk about specific types of policies. So we start actually writing some real policies that apply to the actual domains of information technology. And I'll talk more about what all that stuff is later on. Starting in the next lecture, we'll start breaking apart our information technology into these different domains so that we can study them individually and sort of understand each individually and how we develop IT security policies for each individually and what our concerns are for each one. So that's what we'll talk about next week in the next lecture. If you have any questions, please reach out, email or telephone. All the contact information is obviously in Blackboard. So hopefully if you have any questions, you can reach out, and I look forward to working with you this semester.